The story begins not with a scream, but with silence. A silence that hung over the ancient plains of Mesopotamia, broken only by the slow, rhythmic beating of drums calling the faithful to the heart of Babylon. The city glowed like a mirage of gold and smoke, its ziggurats piercing the dusk sky like stairways to heaven. From afar, it appeared divine, a city built to honor gods who shaped the stars. But as you drew closer, the scent of incense mixed with sweat, oil, and something darker, a whisper of offerings not meant for mortal understanding. In Babylon, everything was sacred, and yet nothing was pure. The people believed that to touch divinity, one must surrender everything, body, dignity, and soul. This was not a world of modest prayers or quiet devotion. This was a world where faith was performed through flesh, where holiness was measured not by silence or fasting, but by the fever of the body and the ecstasy of pain. Here, the boundary between worship and sin did not exist. It was a place where gods demanded more than faith, they demanded participation. Imagine entering the temple of Ishtar at twilight. Torches flicker against marble pillars engraved with scenes of divine copulation. The air is thick with music, flutes, chants, and the low hum of bodies moving in rhythm. Women, painted in gold dust, dance with men wearing masks of beasts and gods. Every motion is deliberate, every breath a prayer. But these are not acts of pleasure alone, they are acts of sacrifice. For in Babylon, to please the gods, one must give the most sacred possession, oneself. The priests taught that desire was not sin but the first language of creation. When the gods made the world, they did so through the union of opposites, light and darkness, male and female, life and death. Every ritual was meant to mirror that cosmic act. Each moan in the temple was believed to echo the cries of the gods themselves during the birth of the universe. And so the people of Babylon believed that through their bodies, they could awaken the divine, that lust could be holy, and shame could purify the soul. But behind the beauty of this belief lay a darker truth. Many came to the temple not out of devotion, but fear. The gods were said to punish those who withheld their offerings. Crops would die, children would fall ill, rivers would dry. To deny the flesh was to deny the gods themselves. And so even the reluctant were drawn into the spiral of ritual, forced to perform acts they barely understood. The city's heartbeat was a mix of devotion and dread, ecstasy and despair. By night, Babylon's ziggurats glowed like towers of flame. By dawn, the streets were littered with the remnants of sacrifice, wilted flowers, ashes, and traces of what had transpired beneath divine eyes. Yet, to the Babylonians, this was glory. They saw themselves not as sinners, but as chosen vessels of cosmic purpose. To outsiders, it was perversion. To them, it was salvation. The contradiction defined Babylon itself, a civilization both enlightened and damned, capable of building wonders while sinking into depravity. Its people lived in the shadow of gods that reflected their own contradictions, merciful and cruel, beautiful and grotesque. In their pursuit of divine favor, they became mirrors of their deities, radiant in splendor, corrupted in soul. This is where our journey begins, in a city that dared to make the body divine and the divine carnal. A city that rose higher than any before it, only to fall into the depths of its own desires. As we uncover the most perverted rituals of ancient Babylon, remember this: they did not see evil in what they did. They saw devotion. And perhaps that is what makes it truly terrifying, that the line between holiness and horror was not broken by sin, but by worship itself. Babylon was not just a city, it was an organism, pulsing with hunger, ambition, and faith. From the Euphrates River to the towering ziggurat of Etemenanke, every inch of its soil seemed to hum with divine energy. To the outside world, Babylon was a miracle, a living embodiment of human greatness, the city where heaven met the flesh. But beneath the layers of gold and glory lay a truth that glittered with corruption. The same hands that built temples to the gods also built houses of forbidden pleasure. The same voices that prayed for salvation whispered in the shadows, offering their bodies to divine lust. The Babylonians did not believe in separating the sacred from the sensual. Their world was built upon the idea that everything of the flesh reflected the divine. The rivers symbolized fertility, the rain was the seed of the heavens falling upon the earth. When the harvest was good, the people believed that the gods had been satisfied, not by words or offerings of grain, but by the ecstasy that echoed from their temples. In Babylon, to please the gods meant to participate in their eternal act of creation. And that act was not born from purity, but passion. Every evening, as the sun sank behind the walls of Ishtar Gate, the city transformed. The streets shimmered with torchlight, and the air filled with the scent of myrrh, honey, and burning cedar. Crowds gathered before the great temples, their faces glowing with a feverish mix of devotion and desire. Women in veils of silk and men adorned with oil and jewels awaited the high priest's signal, the beginning of the ritual that joined heaven and earth. For them, the gods were not distant beings of moral law. The gods were near, embodied in every lover's breath, in every trembling hand that reached out to touch another in worship. At the center of it all stood Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and chaos. Her image towered over Babylon, carved in stone with eyes of lapis lazuli and lips painted red with cinnabar. She was both mother and destroyer, the embodiment of every human impulse denied and desired. Her temple was unlike any other, filled not with silence, but with song, laughter, and moans that echoed into the night. The priestesses who served her were called the holy women, though to later civilizations they would be branded as prostitutes. But to the Babylonians, they were divine intermediaries. Through their bodies, the goddess herself touched mankind. The rituals of Ishtar's cult were both mesmerizing and horrifying. The priests and priestesses, known as the Kadishtu, performed acts of sacred union that symbolized the cosmic marriage between gods and mortals. Foreign travelers wrote of how women, rich and poor alike, would sit within the temple's walls, awaiting a stranger chosen by fate to offer her the coin of Ishtar. Once accepted, she would lead him into the temple chambers, where they would unite under the gaze of the goddess's statue, an act believed to ensure fertility and divine favor. To refuse was to defy the goddess, an act punishable not by law, but by curse. But this was not mere indulgence. It was control. The Temple of Ishtar was both the spiritual and economic heart of Babylon. Every ritual fed into a system that kept the people obedient and the priests powerful. The temples held vast wealth, silver, spices, slaves, and land, accumulated from offerings and rituals. The priesthood dictated not only spiritual doctrine but social order. A woman who refused the ritual could be shunned. A man who insulted the goddess could lose his place in the hierarchy. In this city of sin and splendor, faith became a currency, and pleasure a tax paid to the divine. Yet to those who participated, the experience was not entirely forced. Many sought the temple willingly, longing for the moment when the veil between mortal and God would dissolve. They described the sensation as divine madness, a release that made them forget who they were. For a fleeting instant, they believed they became part of the goddess herself, vessels through which divine desire flowed. It was both liberation and enslavement, a ritual that promised transcendence but delivered surrender. The duality of Babylon was reflected in everything, beauty entwined with decay, holiness shadowed by sin. The same city that created laws and libraries also crafted ceremonies of the flesh. To the Babylonians, this was not contradiction but harmony. The body was the instrument of the soul, and every act of passion was an echo of the gods' eternal dance. Yet to outsiders, Persians, Hebrews, Greeks, Babylon became the embodiment of corruption, the whore of nations, a place where the divine had been sold for pleasure. In truth, Babylon was a mirror held up to humanity itself. It was not the city that was evil, but what it revealed, that beneath every civilization lies a craving for transcendence through forbidden acts. That even the most devout faith can be twisted into the worship of desire. The Babylonians believed they were touching the divine, but in truth, they were touching the most hidden parts of their own nature. And it is here, in the Temple of Ishtar, where the boundary between heaven and flesh dissolves completely, and where the gods themselves begin to blush. The Temple of Ishtar rose like a golden mirage above the city, its walls breathing incense, its steps glistening with the oil of countless feet. This was the heart of Babylon's soul, where desire was law and worship was flesh. Every dawn, as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the ziggurat, the high priestess of Ishtar would ascend its terraces, her voice echoing through the streets like a spell. The people below fell silent, waiting for the first chant, the invocation of the goddess who ruled over their hearts, their crops, and their bodies. Ishtar was not merely a deity to them, she was life itself, the pulse that made the universe tremble. And to serve her was to give everything, mind, body, and blood. Inside the temple, the air shimmered with heat and perfume. Golden braziers burned day and night, filling the halls with the scent of myrrh, sandalwood, and spiced wine. Carvings on the walls told the story of creation, the union of heaven and earth, the sacred merging of gods whose passion had birthed existence. The priests of Ishtar taught that to relive that act through ritual was not a sin but a holy duty. Pleasure was not indulgence, it was communion. And so, within these walls, the faithful sought ecstasy not as a vice but as a way to touch eternity. The priestesses who served Ishtar were known as Naditu and Kadistu, women trained from youth to embody the goddess herself. Their beauty was legendary, but it was not merely physical. They were taught to move, speak, and even breathe in rhythm with ritual. They learned the art of seduction not for pleasure, but for power. To gaze upon one was to feel the presence of Ishtar. Some came from noble families, given to the temple as offerings. Others were chosen for their spiritual charisma, a magnetism that drew people into their orbit like moths to flame. They were both revered and feared, seen as vessels through which divine love flowed and divine wrath could strike. Each night, the temple transformed into a realm beyond morality. Torches flickered along the marble corridors, casting shadows that danced like spirits. Drums beat in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, their sound rising and falling like a heartbeat. The priestesses, adorned in jewels and crimson veils, began their sacred dances, movements that symbolized the creation of the world. Their bodies twisted and swayed as chants filled the air, invoking the goddess's many faces: lover, warrior, destroyer. Men and women alike watched in awe, consumed by the belief that they stood in the presence of something both divine and terrifying. And then came the act of union, the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage. The high priestess, representing Ishtar, would choose a partner, often the king or a man deemed worthy by omen or dream. Before the assembled faithful, they would unite in ritual, symbolizing the mating of heaven and earth. Every sigh, every touch, was believed to awaken the fertility of the land, the health of the people, and the favor of the gods. Around them, the congregation would echo the act, thousands joining in a single, trembling rhythm, a chorus of bodies offering themselves to the divine. The temple became a living cosmos, its every motion a reflection of creation itself. To the participants, this was transcendence. For those moments, they were not mortal, they were fragments of the divine, consumed by the same passion that birthed the stars. Many described visions, glowing lights, whispers of gods, sensations of floating beyond the body. The priests said it was Ishtar's touch, a taste of her ecstasy and fury. For Ishtar was not a gentle goddess. She was the embodiment of chaos and desire, granting life with one hand and destroying with the other. To feel her presence was to risk losing oneself completely. But the rituals had a cost. Many priestesses bore the weight of the goddess's contradictions, worshipped by the people, yet forbidden to live normal lives. They could not marry, could not bear children, could not love as mortals do. Their bodies belonged to Ishtar, their pleasure offered for others, not themselves. Behind their painted eyes and serene smiles often hid exhaustion, even despair. Some whispered that Ishtar consumed her servants as she did her lovers, draining them until nothing remained but devotion. Yet none dared defy her. For in Babylon, to refuse the goddess was to invite ruin. The city's prosperity was tied to these rituals. Every good harvest, every victory in war, was credited to Ishtar's favor. The king himself would visit her temple during the New Year festival, performing the sacred marriage to ensure the land's fertility. Without this union, it was said, the earth would go barren and the gods would turn their faces away. Thus, desire became politics and passion became power. The priesthood controlled the very lifeblood of Babylon, and all of it was sanctified by ritual. Foreign visitors who witnessed these rites were both fascinated and horrified. To the Greeks and Hebrews, it was proof of Babylon's corruption, a civilization ruled by lust disguised as faith. But they misunderstood the psychology behind it. For the Babylonians, these acts were not debauchery. They were surrender, a way to erase the boundary between mortal and divine, to dissolve into something greater. They believed that through ecstasy came understanding, and through pain came purification. To lose oneself in pleasure was to find the gods. And so the Temple of Ishtar remained the beating heart of Babylon, both sacred and sinful, beautiful and cursed. It was a place where men became gods for a night and gods demanded the bodies of men in return. Within its walls, the city's greatest strength, its unrelenting faith, also became its undoing. For the line between worship and madness had long been erased. The people of Babylon did not see it, but with every ritual, they brought themselves closer to the edge, to a point where the gods they adored would no longer bless them, but turn away in shame. In the heart of Babylon, beyond the laughter, music, and feverish devotion of Ishtar's temple, there was a quieter hall, a place filled not with ecstasy but expectation. Here, the air was heavy, not from incense, but from silence. It was where the virgins of the temple waited. They were called the chosen of the goddess, though their purpose was not to serve through worship or song, but through surrender. These young women, untouched by any man, were offerings made to Ishtar herself, living gifts from families who sought divine favor or forgiveness. For some, it was considered the highest honor, for others, a sentence masked as piety. Once dedicated, they ceased to belong to their families. Their lives, their futures, even their purity, became property of the goddess. The ritual began long before the act itself. When a girl was chosen, her body was anointed with oils, her skin rubbed with fragrant resins from Arabia, her hair woven with threads of gold. She was veiled and secluded for weeks, taught prayers and chants meant to align her soul with the goddess's will. The priests said the virgin's body was sacred soil, the seed of the divine would awaken it. Yet in this promise of holiness, there was cruelty. For when her time came, she would be stripped not only of her veil but of her innocence, offered to a stranger whose coin had been accepted by Ishtar's priests. The ritual was called the Night of Consecration, and it marked the transition from mortal girl to divine servant. When the night arrived, torches lined the temple courtyard, and chants filled the air. The priests read omens, stars, smoke, the flight of birds, to determine which man the goddess had chosen. It was said that Ishtar guided his steps, that the stranger was not truly human but a vessel of the god Dumuzi, her eternal lover. The virgin would be brought before the statue of the goddess, towering, radiant, eyes glinting with inlaid lapis lazuli. There, under her unblinking gaze, the ritual would begin. Before the act, the priest would whisper blessings over the girl's body, marking her with sacred oils, each touch both tender and possessive. When the moment came, she would lie upon the altar of stone, and the man, believing himself chosen by divine will, would unite with her in Ishtar's name. To the people watching, it was not a desecration but a miracle. They believed that in the moment of union, the goddess herself entered the girl's body and received the man's offering through her flesh. The cries that filled the temple were said to be the voice of Ishtar, echoing through the mortal world. The man would leave purified, and the woman would rise transformed, a virgin no longer, but a living vessel of divine energy. Her shame was called sanctity, her pain, purification. But beneath the chants and torches, there was something deeply human, fear. Not every girl believed she was chosen. Some wept quietly behind their veils, dreading the night that would steal their childhood. Yet none dared refuse. To reject the ritual was to curse oneself and one's family. The priests would warn that Ishtar's wrath fell swiftly upon the disobedient. Fields would wither, wombs would close, illness would strike. The goddess's love was not gentle. It was fierce, consuming, and without mercy. In the name of holiness, the people obeyed. Even parents who loved their daughters watched in pride as they were taken, believing sacrifice was the price of divine favor. Foreign chroniclers who later wrote of Babylon spoke of these virgins with horror. Herodotus described them waiting in the temple courtyard, veiled, until a stranger cast a coin into their laps. The act, he said, was unavoidable. Every woman, rich or poor, must submit once in her lifetime to honor Melita, whom the Greeks equated with Aphrodite. Once the ritual was done, she could return home, purified in the eyes of the goddess. But for some, home was no longer a place of belonging. Many who returned found themselves changed, revered by some, shunned by others. The sacred act left a stain that even holiness could not wash away. The priests justified it with divine logic. They said that just as the earth must be plowed before it yields fruit, so too must the woman's body be opened to receive the goddess's blessing. To them, purity was not about untouched flesh but about obedience. They believed that through submission, a woman transcended herself, becoming more than mortal. But this theology masked a brutal reality. Babylon had made virtue transactional. Faith was measured in flesh, and a woman's worth was decided by how she pleased the unseen. Yet not all saw it that way. Some women embraced the ritual, finding power within what others called shame. They claimed that in the moment of union, they felt the goddess's fire inside them, that their fear turned to strength, their pain to vision. Some became priestesses themselves, channeling Ishtar's will through dance and prophecy. To them, the ritual was not degradation but transformation, the death of innocence and the birth of divinity. In their eyes, to be touched by a god was not to be defiled but chosen. Still, the contradiction burned like an unspoken wound in Babylonian culture. A city that celebrated beauty and worshipped the body also demanded its violation in the name of faith. The same act that crowned a woman holy could also mark her for life. This paradox haunted Babylon's soul, the belief that one must destroy what is pure to make it divine. The virgins of the temple became symbols of that eternal conflict between devotion and desire, sanctity and sin, love and humiliation. When the night ended, the girl was led to the sacred baths. The priestesses washed her body in perfumed water, singing softly of rebirth and blessing. The stranger's coin was placed at the feet of Ishtar's statue, and the girl was told her sacrifice had pleased the goddess. But as dawn broke and the temple quieted, her gaze often lingered on the fading torches, eyes hollow, lips trembling with a prayer she no longer believed. The goddess was silent, and Babylon moved on, one more offering given, one more soul consumed. And so the ritual continued, night after night, century after century. Thousands of women came and went through the temple's marble halls, each one believing she had touched divinity. Perhaps she had. Or perhaps the gods of Babylon were only mirrors, reflecting the desires and cruelties of those who built them. In the name of holiness, the city offered its daughters to the gods. In the name of faith, it learned to sanctify violation. And as the temple's fires burned against the dark horizon, Babylon's brilliance gleamed all the brighter, because it was lit by the sacrifice of its own innocence. In the heart of Babylon's spiritual hierarchy, there existed a caste of beings who defied every boundary, men who were no longer men, priests who had offered not merely devotion, but their very flesh to the goddess. They were called the Gala, the Asinu, the Kuliu, names whispered with both awe and discomfort. To the Babylonians, they were divine servants of Ishtar, embodiments of her dual nature, the union of masculine and feminine, creation and destruction, love and fury. To outsiders, they were an abomination. But within the temple walls, they were something far more complex, living symbols of transformation, sacrifice, and the terror of divine love. Each gala was chosen through omen, dream, or divine calling. It was said that when Ishtar placed her mark upon a man, he could no longer live as before. The priests would summon him to the temple, and there, under the burning eyes of the goddess's statue, he would renounce his manhood. The ritual was both ecstatic and horrific. Before the assembled congregation, music would rise, flutes, drums, and the steady beat of the sistrum, while the chosen danced, trembling, possessed by Ishtar's spirit. In a state of frenzy, he would seize a blade, his cries echoing through the temple as he cut away the symbol of his masculinity, offering it to the goddess as proof of eternal devotion. The crowd would cheer, believing they had witnessed divine rebirth. The blood that fell upon the temple floor was sacred, a sacrifice of transformation, a mortal becoming godlike through pain. From that moment, the Gala was no longer a man. He was something other, something between worlds. His voice was soft, his body adorned in silks and jewels. He painted his eyes, perfumed his hair, and moved with the grace of the priestesses he served beside. Some describe them as beautiful, others as eerie, their smile serene, their presence unsettling. They became living embodiments of Ishtar's paradox, gentle yet violent, seductive yet terrifying. To touch one was to risk madness, for they carried both the blessing and the curse of the goddess. The rituals they performed were unlike any other. During the festivals of Ishtar, the Asinu would lead processions through the streets of Babylon, singing hymns in high, trembling voices. They danced wildly, their movements both erotic and divine, tearing at their clothes, weeping and laughing in the same breath. It was said that they could summon the goddess's spirit, channel her love or her wrath. Some were seers and healers, others were feared for their curses. When they touched a person's forehead and whispered, "The goddess sees you," even kings trembled. Their existence challenged every law of nature and society. In Babylonian culture, manhood was power, to rule, to fight, to possess. Yet the Gala surrendered that power willingly, trading it for the favor of the goddess. They became living contradictions, holy and unclean, honored yet despised. Ordinary citizens avoided their gaze in the streets, afraid their touch might bring misfortune. Yet during ceremonies, they were revered as divine intermediaries, closer to the gods than any warrior or king. In their eyes, Babylon's pride and Babylon's shame coexisted perfectly. The priests taught that their transformation was not mutilation but transcendence. By renouncing their manhood, they symbolically reenacted the goddess's descent into the underworld, shedding mortal identity to be reborn in divine service. Ishtar herself, myths said, had crossed the boundaries of gender and death. She descended into darkness to challenge Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead, stripping away her garments and power at each gate until she stood naked and helpless, only to return to life, more powerful than before. The Gala mirrored this myth through their own suffering. In losing their flesh, they believed they gained her favor, her divine fire coursing through their veins. They called it Ishtar's breath, a madness that brought both ecstasy and despair. Yet not all found peace in this new form. Some wept in secret, haunted by what they had lost. They were no longer accepted among men, nor fully embraced among women. They belonged only to the temple, to Ishtar's cruel, consuming love. There were whispers of Gala who went mad, hearing the goddess's voice long after rituals ended, or of those who vanished into the desert, seeking silence that never came. Their devotion was absolute, their suffering endless. The goddess gave them power, but she also demanded their pain as tribute. During grand ceremonies, the Asinu's presence could ignite both awe and horror. They would appear before the king, veiled and radiant, carrying sacred instruments. Their dances were filled with divine fury, twisting, trembling, their faces contorted between joy and anguish. They were said to channel the goddess's passion directly, embodying her unrestrained force. In moments of ecstasy, they would wail, tearing at their garments, as if consumed by something beyond human comprehension. The people watching believed they saw the goddess herself dancing through them, and for an instant, Babylon felt the pulse of divinity. But with divine favor came danger. As Babylon grew rich and powerful, these rituals became both spectacle and scandal. Foreign traders whispered of men who had forsaken their sex in madness, of priests who used divine frenzy to manipulate kings. The line between worship and theater blurred. Some Gala used their influence to sway politics, their prophecies guiding wars and marriages. Others became outcasts, wandering the streets like ghosts of devotion, their song reduced to lament. By the later centuries, when Persia and Greece looked upon Babylon, they saw not holiness, but perversion, and the Asinu became living proof of the city's decay. Yet for all the judgment, one truth remained: the Gala were not monsters. They were mirrors, reflecting the extremes of Babylon's faith, the yearning to transcend the human body, to become divine through sacrifice. Their existence asked a question that still echoes through time: how far will a person go to touch the sacred? For the Gala, the answer was written in their blood. As night fell over the city, the Asinu gathered on the temple steps, singing hymns to their goddess. Their voices rose like smoke, piercing the sky, sorrowful, haunting, beautiful. They sang of Ishtar's beauty, her cruelty, her eternal hunger. And in their song was the essence of Babylon itself, a civilization that sought to turn suffering into worship and worship into desire. Beneath the torches' glow, their jeweled bodies shimmered like the stars they prayed to, neither male nor female, neither sinner nor saint, but something beyond all definition. In their existence, the gods of Babylon found their reflection, beautiful, terrifying, and forever insatiable. The air of Babylon shimmered with heat, thick with the scent of incense and wine. Yet beneath the beauty and music, something darker stirred, an ancient hunger that bound heaven and earth. At the height of the Babylonian New Year, when the moon waxed full and the city's ziggurats burned like torches against the night, the people gathered for the most sacred and most terrifying of all rituals, the rite of the burning seed. It was said to be older than Babylon itself, a ceremony born from the very moment the gods split chaos into creation. Every heartbeat, every breath, every act of life was believed to be an echo of that first divine union. And once each year, the Babylonians reenacted it, through ecstasy, through blood, and through the body. The Akita festival, lasting 12 days, marked the renewal of the cosmos. On the surface, it was a time of joy, processions, feasts, offerings, and the cleansing of idols. But beneath the pageantry lay something primal. The people believed that the universe itself depended on these rites, that the order of the world would collapse if the sacred union between god and goddess was not performed. The high priestess, embodying Ishtar, would be joined by the king, who took upon himself the role of Dumuzi, her eternal lover. Their union was not metaphor, it was flesh. In a chamber lined with gold and obsidian, under the watchful eyes of priests, their bodies became vessels through which heaven and earth were reconciled. Outside, the city waited in tense silence. For if the goddess found pleasure, the rivers would rise, the crops would bloom, and life would continue. But if she turned away, famine and death would follow. Before the sacred union, a ritual of purification unfolded, a performance that mingled sensuality with dread. Priests led processions of dancers through the streets, their bodies painted with ash and blood, carrying torches that symbolized the burning seed of creation. The sound of drums rolled through the air, slow and heavy, like a heartbeat echoing from the underworld. Behind them came the Asinu, the eunuch priests of Ishtar, wailing in ecstasy, their bodies trembling as if possessed. They carried bowls of fire and jars of oil, pouring them into braziers that blazed along the temple steps. The fire represented the divine seed, burning, fertile, destructive. To watch it was to glimpse the passion of the gods themselves, who, it was said, created the world not through peace, but through violent union. As the rituals intensified, the city became a living organism. The streets filled with music, laughter, and cries that blurred the line between pleasure and agony. Couples lay beneath the stars, reenacting the goddess's union in miniature, each act of love a prayer, each shudder of release a tribute to creation. The priests encouraged it, declaring that every act of passion was sacred during the festival. The more the people gave themselves to the ecstasy of the goddess, the stronger her presence became. Babylon transformed into a single, trembling body, its heartbeat synced with the rhythm of the drums that echoed from the temple's heights. Inside the sanctum, the air thickened with heat and chanting. The kings stood before the high priestess, their faces illuminated by firelight. She wore a crown of reeds and a veil woven from gold, symbols of fertility and divinity. The priests circled them, invoking the names of the gods. When the moment came, the high priestess lifted her arms, her voice rising in a cry that pierced the night. The drums stopped. The city held its breath. And in that stillness, the sacred act began. It was said that as they joined, the flames of the temple flickered and the earth trembled, a sign that the gods were watching, that heaven and earth had once again become one. But outside, not all rituals were so orderly. In the darker corners of the festival, beyond the temple's walls, other rites took place, acts of frenzy and fire. In the alleys, groups gathered around burning braziers, drinking wine, singing the hymns of Ishtar in distorted tones. Women threw their veils into the flames, symbolizing the surrender of purity. Men painted their faces with soot and blood, dancing until they collapsed in exhaustion. Some rituals involved cuts to the flesh, a drop of blood offered to the goddess, a sign of devotion that blurred into self-destruction. The priests would later claim these were holy acts of purification, but to an outsider, they were scenes of delirium, the city lost in sacred madness. The burning seed itself was the climax. At the temple's heart stood a great brazier where sacred oils and spices burned without rest. Into this flame, the priests would cast symbols of fertility, sheaves of grain, carved figures of animals, and sometimes, according to whispers, living offerings. The fire roared higher, devouring all it was given. It represented the goddess's insatiable hunger, her power to create through destruction. The people believed that as the flames rose, their sins were burned away, their bodies renewed for another year. But beneath the purification was fear. Each year, the fire demanded more, and each year, the line between symbolic offering and real sacrifice grew thinner. The psychological depth of these rituals was immense. They reflected the Babylonians' understanding of creation as a cycle of death and rebirth. To them, pain was not punishment but transformation. Desire was not weakness but the very essence of divine power. The gods themselves had suffered, had died, had been reborn, and so too must humanity. By participating in these acts of blood and passion, they believed they shared in the eternal rhythm of the universe. But in their devotion, they also revealed their torment. To maintain order, they reenacted chaos. To preserve life, they flirted with death. As the festival reached its end, the city fell into silence. The fires burned low, the music faded, and the priests carried the ashes of the burnt offerings to the river. There, they scattered them into the current, watching the dark waters swallow the remains. The people believed that the river carried their prayers to the underworld, where the goddess would receive them and restore balance. Yet as dawn rose over Babylon, one could not help but wonder what price had been paid for that balance. The temple floors were stained, the air heavy with smoke and sweat. The gods were appeased, for now. To the Babylonians, this was holiness, beauty born of destruction, purity achieved through indulgence. The Akita festival, with its fire and flesh, was a reflection of their entire civilization, brilliant, disciplined, yet driven by desires too vast to contain. It was a celebration of creation and a rehearsal of apocalypse. They believed that as long as they continued the rites, the world would endure. But in their relentless effort to control divine will, they failed to see that they were feeding something far greater than themselves, a hunger that even the gods could not satisfy. By night's end, when the last flames died and the stars faded, Babylon returned to its ordinary splendor. Yet beneath the glittering facades and perfumed air, the city still pulsed with that dark energy, the same one that had built its temples and doomed its soul. The rite of the burning seed was not merely a ritual. It was Babylon's heartbeat, fierce, seductive, and eternal. And as long as the fires of Ishtar's altar burned, the city would continue to dance between worship and damnation, never realizing that in trying to please the gods, it had become a reflection of their own most forbidden desires. The gods of Babylon were not merciful. They were vast, unpredictable, and terrifying mirrors of the people who created them. Among them, none reflected human contradiction more vividly than Ishtar, the goddess who gave life through love and destroyed it through desire. To serve her was to embrace duality. To worship her was to walk a blade between ecstasy and ruin. Yet by the final centuries of Babylon's glory, even the priests began to whisper that something was wrong. The rituals had grown darker, the offerings more desperate. It was said that the gods had turned their faces away, ashamed of the very acts performed in their name. And so began the era remembered in dread, the time when holiness turned to horror, when the gods themselves seemed to blush. At first, the signs were subtle. The stars that guided the priests' divinations began to shift in unfamiliar patterns. The sacred river, once thought to carry the goddess's blessings, overflowed its banks, drowning the fields instead of feeding them. Plagues spread through the city. The people whispered that Ishtar had grown angry, that her temples, once filled with music and devotion, had become prisons of sin. But the priests, desperate to regain divine favor, responded not with humility, but escalation. If the gods demanded devotion, they would offer more. If the goddess sought purity, they would give her pain. The rituals that had once been symbols of cosmic harmony now twisted into spectacles of fear. During the sacred nights, the chants grew louder, more frantic. The priestesses of Ishtar no longer danced with grace. They convulsed as if possessed, their cries echoing through the marble halls. The gala priests slashed their skin with knives, letting blood drip upon the temple floor as they screamed the goddess's name. The sacred fires burned hotter, consuming not just incense but flesh. What had begun as ritual purification transformed into acts of agony. Some whispered that the goddess demanded it, that she fed upon pain, not prayer. Others feared that these were not the gods at all, but something else wearing their faces. The high priests justified every excess with theology. They preached that the goddess's shame was humanity's salvation, that by embracing sin before her, mortals humbled themselves into holiness. They claimed that every act of lust, every drop of blood spilled in her name, purified the city. But the people saw what the priests denied. The rituals had become monstrous. Virgins no longer waited to be chosen, they were taken. The sacred marriage between king and priestess, once symbolic of cosmic renewal, became a political performance to mask corruption. The goddess's festivals turned from celebration to chaos, drunken mobs filling the streets, their songs devolving into screams. The divine had become indistinguishable from the obscene. In the shadow of the ziggurat, the once beautiful temples now reeked of death and sweat. Offerings of fruit and perfume were replaced by sacrifices of animals, and, according to some accounts, even humans. The priests claimed that only through suffering could Babylon's sins be cleansed. When the goddess's favor seemed absent, they raised the stakes. The fires of Ishtar's altars burned all night, fed by anything that could bleed. Witnesses described the priests chanting over the smoke, claiming to see her face within the flames, not beautiful and radiant, but twisted, furious, unrecognizable. They said the goddess was ashamed, not of the people, but of what she had become through them. The stories that emerged from this time are among the darkest in Babylonian memory. One tablet fragment speaks of the Night of the Shamed God, a ritual so terrible that even the scribes refused to record its details. It was said that during this ceremony, the priests reenacted the goddess's descent into the underworld, not through dance or prayer, but through the mutilation of her chosen vessels. The screams that filled the temple that night were said to echo across the city, carrying with them the stench of burning flesh. At dawn, the priests declared that Ishtar had been reborn, purified by the blood of her servants. But the people no longer celebrated. They locked their doors and whispered prayers not to the goddess, but to whatever would keep her wrath away. Psychologically, the transformation was inevitable. Babylon's faith had always been rooted in extremes: pleasure and pain, love and war, life and death. The line between worship and transgression had always been thin. But now, as the empire aged and its glory began to fade, fear replaced passion. The people's faith was no longer born of devotion but desperation. Each ritual became an act of bargaining, a plea to the gods to delay their punishment a little longer. The more the priests demanded, the more the people gave. Yet the gods remained silent, and the silence itself became unbearable. Foreign observers saw what Babylon could not. The Persians, the Hebrews, and later the Greeks all wrote of this period with disgust and fascination. To them, Babylon was no longer the jewel of the ancient world but a corpse of a city still pretending to live. Its temples, once the pride of kings, were now dens of perversion. Its rituals were seen as mockeries of true divinity. The Hebrew prophets, writing in exile, described Babylon as the great harlot, the city that seduced the nations and then drowned in her own lust. To them, Babylon's downfall was not just political but moral, proof that no empire, however glorious, could survive once it made sin into sacrament. Yet within Babylon itself, a different truth lingered, one more haunting than the accusations of outsiders. The people did not believe they were corrupt. They believed they were faithful. Every act of excess, every ritual of torment, was done in the name of devotion. They believed they were saving the world from chaos, renewing the bond between gods and mortals. In their eyes, the shame was not theirs but the gods'. For it was the gods who demanded these rituals, the gods who turned love into duty, beauty into horror. Babylon was simply obeying divine law, and if the gods were disgusted, then perhaps the gods themselves were unworthy. And so, as the city's glory began to crumble, the priests continued their ceremonies with manic fervor. The fires still burned, the drums still pounded, the bodies still swayed in trance. But the eyes of the idols grew dull, their gold faces blackened by soot. The hymns, once songs of joy, became dirges of exhaustion. The goddess had not abandoned Babylon, she had been consumed by it. The people had made her in their image, and in doing so, they had destroyed her purity. Holiness and horror had become the same thing. The line between God and human, between worshipper and victim, had vanished completely. As the last light of the temple flickered, a question remained, lingering like smoke in the air. Who had truly sinned, the people who obeyed the gods, or the gods who demanded such obedience? In that question lay the essence of Babylon's tragedy. For in trying to reach the divine, the Babylonians had become monstrous reflections of their own gods. And in the end, even the heavens seemed to look away, unable to bear the sight of what devotion had become. The fires that once lit Babylon's temples had begun to die. The marble pillars were cracked, their carvings eroded by time and neglect. The streets that had once overflowed with song and incense now echoed with the weary shuffle of merchants and soldiers. The goddess's temples still stood, proud, magnificent, yet hollow. Where there had once been music, there was silence. Where there had been offerings of flowers and gold, there was ash. The city that had once declared itself the heart of the gods now felt abandoned by them. The divine no longer spoke through the voices of priests or the cries of worshippers. It spoke only through ruin. When the Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, they found not a city of saints, but a corpse of faith. The once mighty ziggurats stood like burnt altars, their fires long extinguished. The sacred courtyards were empty except for bones, offerings, or victims. It was no longer clear. The priests still recited the old hymns, but their voices were hoarse, mechanical, stripped of conviction. The goddess's statue had been carried off by the invaders, yet many whispered that Ishtar had already left long before the armies arrived. Her temples were now monuments to a memory, to a time when the divine had walked among mortals, and mortals had dared to touch the divine. In the aftermath of conquest, the rituals faded like embers in the wind. The new rulers forbade the more extreme rites, the sacred prostitution, the bloodletting, the frenzied dances of the Asinu. The fires of Ishtar's altars were extinguished, the sacred instruments locked away. For the first time in centuries, Babylonian nights fell silent. Yet in that silence, the people felt the absence of something vital. The goddess who had once demanded their flesh, their passion, their tears, was gone. And with her, something in the human soul seemed to die as well. The citizens still prayed, still offered incense in secret, but the rituals no longer carried the same fever. Faith had become habit, devotion reduced to memory. For those who had once served her, the priestesses, the gala, the temple virgins, the fall of the cult was both liberation and loss. Some fled into the countryside, seeking new lives among farmers and traders. Others remained, wandering the temple ruins like ghosts, unable to let go of the only life they had ever known. The Asinu, once praised as divine intermediaries, became outcasts, mocked and reviled by the new Persian authorities. They were reminders of a world that no longer made sense, living relics of a vanished age when pain was holiness and the body was divine. In their eyes lingered the tragedy of Babylon itself, the awareness that they had given everything for gods who no longer listened. The city tried to cleanse itself of its past. The Persians introduced new deities, new laws, new ways of worship. The cult of Ishtar was dismantled, its records destroyed or rewritten. The temple stones were reused to build administrative halls and military outposts. Over time, even the name of the goddess faded. The people learned to speak of her with hesitation, as if invoking her would awaken old curses. Yet her shadow lingered, in songs, in myths, in the whispered fears of lovers and mothers. They said that on certain nights, when the moon rose red and full, the sound of drums could still be heard faintly from beneath the ziggurat, the echo of a ritual that refused to die. It was then that Babylon's name began to change meaning. Once a symbol of divine glory, it became a warning, a word that meant corruption, arrogance, excess. The Hebrews, who had lived under Babylonian captivity, transformed the city into a metaphor for sin. In their writings, Babylon became the great whore, the embodiment of mankind's rebellion against heaven. Her temples of love were recast as brothels of blasphemy. Her priestesses became harlots. Her priests, demons. The city that once claimed to serve the gods became the cautionary tale of those who defied them. Babylon, once the bridge between heaven and earth, was now the pit that led to hell. Yet history is rarely so simple. Beneath the condemnation lay fascination. The Greeks, arriving centuries later, could not help but marvel at what remained, the ruins of temples so vast that they seemed to defy imagination. They wrote of the cult of Ishtar not as a sin, but as a mystery, a glimpse into the human yearning to unite with the divine through the body. To them, Babylon was not evil, merely misunderstood. Its excesses were the consequence of its ambition. It had reached for the gods and burned itself in the attempt. In their retellings, the goddess became Aphrodite, the fallen city a mirror of humanity's eternal struggle between desire and destruction. For the people who still lived among the ruins, that struggle never ended. The old rituals may have vanished, but the longing they embodied could not be erased. Farmers still left offerings of bread and honey at riverbanks, murmuring prayers for fertility. Women whispered Ishtar's name during childbirth, calling upon her strength. Lovers carved her symbol into clay lamps before lighting them. The city's faith had changed, but its hunger for connection, for meaning through pleasure, for power through surrender, remained. Even as Babylon decayed, the essence of its religion lived on, woven into human behavior itself. Over time, the temples crumbled into dust, their stones swallowed by sand and silence. But deep beneath the ruins, archaeologists would one day uncover tablets filled with hymns, words of devotion written thousands of years earlier. In them, Ishtar's voice still spoke, fierce, sorrowful, divine. I am the lover and the beloved. I am the virgin and the whore. I am the mother of life and the destroyer of worlds. These words, carved by trembling hands, revealed the truth Babylon had always known but could never accept, that the divine and the depraved are not opposites, but reflections of each other. In the end, Babylon's fall was not a punishment, but an awakening. The city had exhausted every form of worship, every act of desire, until it stood naked before the gods it had created. It had sought divinity through pleasure, purity through violation, salvation through sin. And when the smoke cleared, what remained was not condemnation, but clarity, the realization that the gods of Babylon had never truly existed beyond the human mind. They were born from the same place as lust, fear, and longing, the hidden corners of the soul. As night once again descended upon the ruins, the wind swept through the empty courtyards where torches once burned. The last echoes of the goddess seemed to linger in the air, the memory of her laughter, her weeping, her hunger. And though the temples were silent, her spirit endured, not in marble or fire, but in the hearts of all who still chase the forbidden in search of meaning. For the fall of Babylon was not the death of a city. It was the death of illusion, the end of the belief that the gods lived above us. The truth was far darker, far simpler. The gods had always lived within us, waiting to be remembered in the ashes of desire. When Babylon finally fell silent, it was not only a city that died, it was a dream. The towers that once touched the heavens now lay broken beneath desert winds, their stones swallowed by sand. The ziggurats that had once echoed with the songs of Ishtar stood dark and hollow, their fires long extinguished. Yet in that silence, something remained, not divine, but human. Babylon had perished, but what it revealed about mankind could never be buried. For centuries, people would remember it as the whore of the East, the city that traded its soul for pleasure. But those who truly looked deeper saw something else, a reflection of themselves. Babylon had not fallen because of lust or corruption alone. It fell because it mistook desire for holiness, pleasure for purpose. Its people believed that by surrendering to their flesh, they could touch the gods. And in a way, they did. But the gods they reached were mirrors, reflecting back their own longing, fear, and hunger. The ruins of Babylon became a symbol, not of sin, but of the eternal struggle between devotion and desire. Every civilization that came after carried a fragment of its spirit. The Greeks worshipped Aphrodite, the Romans Venus. The Christians spoke of temptation and the fall of man. Different names, same truth. Humanity has never stopped trying to turn passion into prayer. The temples have changed, but the rituals remain, whispered in bedrooms, painted in art, hidden in confession. The hunger to feel divine through the body still burns, just as it did in Ishtar's halls. Babylon's legacy is not its rituals or its temples, but the revelation that faith and corruption are born from the same seed. The people sought the gods not through cruelty, but through longing, a longing to transcend the limits of flesh, to become immortal through desire. That is why Babylon haunts history. It was not a city of monsters, but of dreamers who reached too high, who mistook the heat of their own passion for divine light. Even today, we build our own Babylons, temples of fame, wealth, lust, and power. We worship under new names, but the pattern is the same. The gods of pleasure still whisper, promising transcendence through excess, meaning through indulgence. And like the Babylonians, we follow, believing that surrender will save us. But each time we do, we come closer to the same fate, the quiet ruin that follows when faith turns to obsession. As the last light fades over the desert, the wind moves through the fallen stones, carrying echoes of hymns once sung to a goddess who demanded everything. The city is gone, but its spirit endures, a warning and a mirror. Babylon's fall reminds us that the divine we chase is not above us but within us, and that when we try to possess it through desire, it consumes us instead. The gods did not destroy Babylon. Babylon destroyed itself, in its endless hunger to please them. And perhaps that is the lesson it leaves behind, that what we worship most passionately often becomes the fire that burns us. In that truth lies the immortality of Babylon, not in its walls or its gold, but in the reflection it left in the human heart. Babylon may be dust, but the God within us still breathes, restless, seductive, and unrepentant. As long as humans crave the forbidden, as long as they search for heaven through the body, Babylon will never truly die. It will live in every heartbeat that trembles between faith and desire, every soul that dares to touch the sacred and feels only the burn.